All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the last in the series of talks by Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, who needs no introduction. He's had a long career with the Singapore Foreign Service, rising to the Permanent Secretary and then having served as Ambassador at Large before retiring. So I'm Ian Chong, I'm the moderator for this evening, and you're here to hear Mr. Kausikan talk, not me, so I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Prof. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last lecture, and I see some familiar faces, so I guess, masochism is alive and well in National University. But anyway, thank you for staying the course. Since this is the last lecture, let me begin by briefly summarizing the essential argument I made over the previous 4 lectures. A small city-state has no intrinsic relevance, and the creation and maintenance of relevance is therefore a strategic imperative for small city-states. And since 1965, all we have been achieved has built on a foundation of multiracial meritocracy. We take this for granted, but this is a unique organizing principle which differentiates Singapore. Anyway, since 1965, all we have done and achieved has built on this foundation. And this is what differentiates Singapore from every other country in our region. And by region, in this case, I mean Asia. To remain relevant, a small city-state cannot be just like any other country. And therefore, the preservation of what makes us unique is our core national interest. As Mr. Rajaratnam stressed in his first speech on foreign policy to Parliament barely 5 months after we had independence thrust upon us, and I quote, "Our ultimate goal is the preservation of the essential values on which our society is founded," end of quote. Now, fatalism is fatal to small countries. Small countries are obviously much more price takers than price setters. But small countries are also never entirely without agency. And what makes us unique, multiracial meritocracy, is not a self-sustaining value. Because it is unique, it is constantly under pressure and has to be actively defended, internally as well as externally. We don't go around looking for trouble, but to defend our uniqueness requires an activist foreign policy. And we must clinically calculate the dangers and possibilities and act when we must. This sometimes creates risks, particularly but not solely with our immediate neighbors. Regional organizations like ASEAN and international organizations like the United Nations can mitigate the risks, but never entirely erase them. But there is no alternative. We cannot be passive. To be relevant, as I said in my first lecture, small countries must not behave like small countries. And this brings me back to where I ended my first lecture, the controversy generated by Kishore Mahbubani's article of 1st July 2017, whose conclusion was that, and I quote, "Small states must always behave like small states." Now, the article criticized our position on the South China Sea and in particular our position on the arbitral tribunal that ruled in favor of the Philippines in July 2016. It argued that although Lee Kuan Yew had commented on matters involving great powers, now that he was no longer with us, and I quote, "we should change our behavior significantly," end quote. And quote again, "we should be very restrained on commenting on matters involving great powers." And that, quote again, "it would have been wiser to be more circumspect on the judgment of an international tribunal on the arbitration, especially since the Philippines, which instituted the case, did not want to press it." And it concluded that sometimes, and I quote, "principle and ethics must take a backseat to the pragmatic path of prudence," end quote. Now, I don't disagree that it is sometimes necessary to be pragmatic and prudent. That's obvious, We certainly should not be reckless. But the operative word is sometimes. Was this one of those sometimes? If so, why? If not, why not? And this lecture will try to answer these questions, and by doing so, set out perhaps the most fundamental tenet of Singapore's foreign policy. Our statement on the South China Sea that Kishore took objection to said nothing that had not been said many times previously. After noting the tribunal's award and that Singapore was studying it, the statement said that while Singapore was not a claimant state and did not take sides on competing territorial claims, as a small state we supported the peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with international law, in particular UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the maintenance of a rules-based order that protects the rights and privileges of all states. It also said that Singapore valued its long-standing and friendly relations with all parties and urged all parties to respect legal and diplomatic processes, exercise self-restraint, and avoid any activities that may raise tensions in the region. And the statement concluded by reiterating Singapore's support for the full and effective implementation of the Declaration of the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea and the expeditious conclusion of a legally binding Code of Conduct. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for inflicting all that on you. But if you were already bored and your eyes were starting to glaze over, that was the point. It was by design a boring statement. And what made these often repeated, neutral, indeed somewhat platitudinous sentiments suddenly objectionable? What exactly was the principle at stake? What was our national interest in this particular case? Now, none of these questions can be answered without our understanding of the context. But the article only referred to the blockade that had been imposed on Qatar by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Qatar had been accused by its neighbors of supporting terrorist organizations that sought the overthrow of their regimes. How was this relevant to us? What did we do that could have been considered such a threat? It defies even the most vivid imagination to believe that our statement on the South China Sea could have had effects comparable to what Qatar had been accused of doing. And by the way, the dispute between Saudi Arabia's royal family and the Qatari royal family goes back several generations. And this is the latest manifestation of that dispute. Now, the article in question studiously avoided any mention of what was in fact the relevant context. And that was this. In 2016-2017, Singapore's generally friendly and stable relationship with China had taken a downturn. And the proximate cause was Singapore becoming ASEAN country coordinator for China in 2015. And this is a post held by ASEAN member states by rotation for a 3-year term. ASEAN country coordinator's role is to try and get a common position, or at least try and get not too incompatible positions between the 10 members of ASEAN in the relationship with the dialogue partners, of which China is one, US, Japan, and all this case. But somehow, Beijing seems to have convinced itself that the role of country coordinator entails Singapore coordinating ASEAN's position on China's behalf, which is a complete reversal of what the ASEAN coordinator is supposed to do. And China's expectation of Singapore may have been unrealistically high. Now, any experienced Singapore diplomat should know that China, despite our consistent denials, persists in referring to Singapore as a Chinese country. And regarding Singapore as a Chinese country, the expectation may have been that we would naturally take China's part, irrespective of our own national interests. So China criticized Singapore's support for South China Sea disputes being resolved in accordance with international law as so-called taking sides against it. China objected to Singapore leaders and officials even mentioning the South China Sea issue. And when Singapore stood firm on its right to state its position on an issue of undoubted importance to us and to the region, the Chinese activated their influence apparatus and went into high gear to pressure the government, our government, to change position. Now, Singapore's rigorous standards of governance and zero tolerance for corruption makes it well nigh impossible to bribe or openly suborn political leaders or opinion makers. But we are not immune to psychological manipulation by influence operations. Now, all countries conduct influence operations, which are efforts by overt or covert means to persuade, induce, or suborn decision makers and opinion shapers of other countries to serve their interests. And one of China's defenses is everybody does it. In fact, the Chinese ambassador, when he got rather angry with me by exposing the influence operation last year, wrote a letter to the Straits Times, the gist of which was says, so what, everybody does it. Well, arguing that everybody does it is a little bit like arguing that since, unfortunately, many husbands beat their wives, wife beating is acceptable. And not all influence operations pose the same degree of risk. The uniqueness of Beijing's influence operations stems from China's triple identities. And this prescribes three tracks on which Beijing conducts its foreign policy and influence operations. First, the People's Republic of China is a state like any other state, operating within a still largely Westphalian international order. A key Westphalian norm is non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. This is a norm which Beijing never tires of emphasizing, but which is everywhere as often honored by its breach. Everywhere and by every country, I should say, as often honored by its breach than its observance. For me, I, for example, have spent my entire career as an overt declared agent or influence of the Singapore government, also known as a diplomat. But, and it's a big but, the means by which a diplomat can legitimately try to exercise influence are set out in the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, to which every member of the international community, at least in principle, subscribes. Now, on this first track of state-to-state relations, there's nothing particularly unusual about what Beijing does, except, as I noted in my last lecture, the unusually assertive behavior of some Chinese diplomats of late in countries as far-ranging as Malaysia, the PNG, and Sweden. So that's the first track, state-to-state. But secondly, the PRC is not just any state, it's also a Leninist state, an identity that President Xi Jinping has emphasized by his greater insistence on party discipline, party control. And the characteristic modus operandi of a Leninist state is the United Front, which Mao Zedong called the Chinese Communist Party's magic weapon. Now, within China, internally in China, the United Front Work Department, which Xi Jinping has strengthened, by the way, is mainly domestic in its focus. But the main characteristic of a Leninist state is the total subordination of state and society to the interests of the party, irrespective of whether the party's interest is internal or external. And as such, the United Front represents a blurring of the distinction between domestic and foreign policies and a significant modification of the principle of non-interference that goes far beyond what is generally considered acceptable diplomatic practice. So, PRC is a state like any other. PRC is a Leninist state, but thirdly, the PRC is also a civilizational state, the embodiment and exemplar of millennia of the Chinese nation's history and culture, now rejuvenated under Xi Jinping's leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. And this identity as a civilizational state finds expression in the work of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. Now, in 2014, in a speech to the 7th Conference of Overseas Chinese Associations, Xi Jinping stated his aim very plainly, and I quote, "The rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is a dream shared by all Chinese, all Chinese." And in January 2018, Politburo member and former State Councillor and Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi made the objective even clearer when he called upon the government to expand and strengthen overseas Chinese patriotic friendly forces in the service of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And in August last year, the Deputy Director of the United Front Work Department stated that overseas Chinese should, and I quote, strive to become active promoters of mutual political trust and mutually beneficial relations between China and neighboring countries. Now, put this all in plain language. In plain language, overseas Chinese should identify their interests with China's interests and work to advance China's interests. And this represents a deliberate blurring of the distinction made more than 6 decades ago between the Huaren, the ethnic Chinese, which may be overseas Chinese of any citizenship, of different citizenships, and the Huaqiao, PRC citizens of Chinese ethnicity. In March 2018, just in case we are all too obtuse to get the point, in March 2018, Xi Jinping placed the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office under the control of the United Front Work Department. One could not ask for a clearer signal of China's intentions, which on this track clearly go far beyond any Westphalian norm. Now, these three identities prescribe 3 tracks on which China conducts relationships. And taken holistically, they create a sophisticated and flexible instrument of influence that is far more effective than the conventional operations conducted by other countries. China's influence operations are effective because the 3 tracks on which it operates makes them difficult to deal with or even grasp, even understand in entirety. Let me give you just an example, hypothetically. On the first track of state-to-state relations, the usual tactics of persuasion, inducement, or coercion may be deployed as appropriate, whether overtly through diplomacy or covertly through intelligence organizations. But the United Front may simultaneously operate to, for example, emphasize coercion or inducement, even as the first track stresses persuasion. And the third, civilizational track, may concurrently wrap everything up in appeals to ethnic pride. And there is an almost infinite variety of combinations. Now, the natural tendency of all governments, and in particular foreign ministries, is to focus on the first track of state-to-state relations and to want to keep them on even keel. Now, who doesn't want a good relation with China? Who goes looking for trouble? But this can all too easily lead to Chinese activities on the other 2 tracks being overlooked or downplayed. And this tendency is exacerbated by the competing considerations generated by a more crowded and complicated domestic political environment. Now, China's holistic approach is deployed within an overarching narrative of China's inevitable and unstoppable rise and America's equally inevitable and absolute decline. And the Belt and Road Initiative fits into this narrative. China's rise is a powerful narrative because it is not a total fabrication. It only leaves out crucial facts or is so grossly simplified to be a distortion of far more complex realities. That's why I spent the whole of last lecture, the 4th lecture, explaining why this idea of China's rise and America's relative, not absolute decline, is not wrong, but it's a trope. Not inaccurate, but grossly oversimplified. And this is all buttressed by the tendency of scholarly media and even official analysis to view US-China relations in simplistic binary terms, whereas China's rise is necessarily America's decline. As I emphasized in my last lecture, this is a trope which ignores China's many internal complications and America's inherent strengths. Now, this narrative and others were propagated by various means. WeChat with Chinese-speaking populations, social and mainstream media, whispering campaigns, business, clan, cultural associations, as well as conventional agents of influence reporting to Chinese intelligence organizations who cultivate what Lenin called useful idiots. Now, most people in every country take only a cursory interest in foreign affairs and thus find superficial narratives plausible. And for others, there is always the promise of reward or the threat of punishment to encourage the witting or unwitting suspension of critical faculties. And the aim is to create a psychological environment that facilitates China's favorite tactic, And this tactic is simply to pose false choices and to force you to choose between them. China does not just want to direct behavior, to tell you what to do. China wants to condition behavior so that you will do what is necessary without being told. Correct thinking leading naturally to correct behavior. After all, if China is destined to rule the world, why not get on the right side of history? Now, in 2016-2017, at the state-to-state level, Chinese diplomats called upon Singapore to explain China's position on the South China Sea to other ASEAN countries, or to ensure that the issue was not raised in ASEAN forums, or if raised, downplayed. Now, nothing unusual about this. Such demarches to ask exactly the same thing have been routine in all ASEAN countries for many, many years. But this time, the overly simplified but superficially plausible story of China's rise and America's decline was simultaneously spread in Singapore the other two tracks of Chinese foreign policy by the various means previously outlined, social media being particularly prominent. And the unexpected election of Donald Trump, whose penchant for flamboyant statements and disruptive tactics distracts attention from the essential continuity of many aspects of American foreign policy, helped lend credibility to the Chinese narrative. The discomfort of the Western media and foreign policy establishment with Trump and their constant criticism of him helped amplify the effect of the Chinese narrative in Singapore. And within this overall narrative, China's rise, America's decline, were sub-narratives that were very specific to Singapore. And there are three, which I identified. First, unlike Lee Kuan Yew, who had died in 2015, the current Singapore leadership under Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong does not know how to deal with China. Relations were so much better then. Second, Singapore has no territorial claims in the South China Sea. Why was it siding with the US against China? And third, surely as a Chinese country, Singapore should explain China's position to others or stay neutral. And it was difficult to pin down the precise origins of such narratives, but the messaging was too consistent and too insistent to be coincidental. What was omitted? Omitted was the historical fact that Lee Kuan Yew was the only non-communist leader who went into a Chinese Communist Party-backed United Front and emerged the winner. That drew the only one, there's no other example of a non-communist leader going into a CCP-backed United Front and winning. And that drew a red line on the basis of which relations with China were subsequently developed by him and his successors. Well, we don't have territorial claims, that's true, but not having territorial claims in the South China Sea does not mean Singapore has no interest. And most crucially of all, although the majority of Singaporeans are ethnic Chinese, Singapore is a multiracial country organized on the basis of meritocracy. But many Singaporeans did not realize they were being fed oversimplifications and swallowed them whole, or played along for other reasons. Businessmen, academics, and others with interest in China were given broad hints that their interests might suffer unless Singapore was more accommodating and passed the messages to the government. The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiatives, was dangled as bait, and the possibility of being excluded loomed as a threat, even though developed Singapore does not need BRI infrastructure, and Xi Jinping himself had asked Singapore to start a BRI-related project in Chongqing. There was no suggestion that China did not want us out of the Chongqing that China wanted us out of the Chongqing project because it was clearly to China's benefit. But Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was pointedly not invited to the BRI summit held in Beijing in 2017, although Singapore was represented at a lower level. Appeals to ethnic pride were made to yet others. The aim was to instill a fatalistic acceptance of the inevitability and desirability of a Chinese identity for multiracial Singapore and get Singaporeans to pressure the government to align Singapore's national interests with China's interests. Now, at the end of my second lecture, I drew your attention to a 1970 statement by Dr. Goh Keng Swee. Goh Keng Swee was then speaking of the problems of relations with Malaysia and Indonesia. But as his general point is as or perhaps even more relevant to our relationship with China, let me remind you again of what Dr. Goh had said. It's a very important statement. And I quote, "A more important source of difficulty stems from our economic role as a trading center of the region. Our businessmen in the ordinary course of work have numerous dealings with government officials of these countries. They have to obtain licenses, concessions, contracts, and permits. Thus, the Singapore businessman, in the eyes of these governments, performs the role of supplicant for favors. And as our businessmen often compete in their supplications, the image that this creates of Singapore can well be imagined. It is not unnatural, I suppose, for these governments to expect the Singapore government to behave in like manner. Businessmen have never hesitated to give me free advice on how to conduct foreign relations during the periodic rows that we have had with our neighbors. Unfortunately, they do not understand, and I am afraid cannot understand, that in the nature of things, relations between independent sovereign states cannot be conducted on the basis of supplicant and overlord. And the methods they found so successful in business are not available to us as a government." End of quote. Now, you just add the Chinese Communist Party to the entities which our businessmen must make supplications when working in China, and the continuing relevance of Dr. Goh's 1970s statement will immediately be apparent. And the mindset that Dr. Goh described in 1970 creates a dilemma for the Singapore government when dealing with China. Now, China's current and growing economic importance is a fact that cannot be ignored. And so the government must emphasize China's economic importance. And that the facility of a large section of Singaporeans in Chinese languages, not just Mandarin, but dialects too, may give us a comparative advantage that it would be foolish to ignore. So the government must do this. It would be irresponsible of the government not to do so. But in the process, the equally important fact that we are nevertheless not a Chinese country tends to be blurred in the public mind. And this may make us, or at least a section of Singaporeans, more vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Policy always involves trade-offs between equally desirable objectives, and as I have said in an earlier lecture, the government cannot always explain everything. Now, Singapore is not only unique because we are the only ethnic majority sovereign state outside Greater China. The majority of our population is also fluent in English. This is a tremendous advantage, plugging us into the international system and giving us immediate access to information in a way that no other Southeast Asian country can match. But this may also make us doubly vulnerable. On the one hand, there are the pulls of legitimate ethnic pride. Nobody should be ashamed of or deny their ethnicity. On the other hand, far too many Singaporeans form their opinions from an uncritical reading of the Western media. And it does not help that the Straits Times regularly reports on American politics by reproducing stories from the Western media. And so the trope of America's absolute decline under Trump is propagated. Unwittingly by the Straits Times, I hasten to add. At least I hope it is unwitting. At least they assure me it is unwitting, but they continue doing it nonetheless. And they have a correspondent in Washington, D.C., a very good fellow, Nirmal Ghosh, but they hardly publish anything by him. Why? I don't know. You'll go and ask them. Now, these two characteristics of Singapore, our ethnic composition and the fact we are English-speaking by and large, can result in very peculiar psychological effects. And let me give you an example, personal example. Not so long ago, a family friend, ethnic Chinese but born and raised in Singapore, took me to task for being critical of Chinese influence operations and exposing some of the simplifications of the trope of China's rise. Now, my family friend is intelligent, had a very successful career that, as far as I know, had little, if anything, to do with China, and was educated at a British university. Now, I don't mind criticism and debate, but my family friend chided me by pointing out that prominently displayed in the living room of my family home is a portrait of one of my ancestors, my great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather to be exact, dressed in Chinese robes. And that's true. The maternal side of my family is Chinese. But what the hell has that got to do with the price of beans? Now, this is an amusing example, huh? But my point is that it was an emotional and not a reasoned reaction to criticism of China. And there are more serious examples of much the same psychological dynamic. To underscore that we are not a Chinese country, as a matter of policy, Singapore officials and leaders speak to their Chinese counterparts in English during official meetings, even if they are fluent in Mandarin. Our Prime Minister does so, and he's very fluent in Mandarin. Still, I know of some senior officers who think that we should speak in Mandarin to Chinese officials in order to create rapport with their Chinese counterparts, and I know they have done so during official meetings. You're going to have coffee, speak any damn thing you want, as long as the other person can understand you, but I know they have done so during official meetings. Fortunately, the number of such officials is not large and their intentions are not malignant. But if senior public servants can confuse having good personal relations with core national interests, how much more may the general public be confused? Now, I don't want to overstate the point, but the issue is real and not trivial. In any case, and for whatever reason, the 2016-2017 Chinese influence operation was effective. It has to be admitted, was quite effective. The pressures on the government were great. It was very difficult to explain the somewhat abstract importance of UNCLOS or the nuances of our position on the South China Sea or the complications of our relations with China to the general public to whom the Chinese narratives were more easily understood. And it cannot be denied that ethnic appeals resonated strongly with a probably not insignificant section of our public. Then, Beijing went too far. As many of you may remember, in November 2016, 9 Singapore armored personnel carriers en route home from an overseas military exercise were seized by China on the flimsiest of excuses. All Singaporeans immediately understood that this was naked intimidation. And even the Chinese educated leader of the Opposition Workers' Party, Mr. Lau Tia-Kiang, criticized China in Parliament, saying that he was personally wary of China's political ambitions and that while Singaporeans should leverage on linguistic and other connections with China for economic advantage, they must bear in mind that Singapore is first and foremost a multiracial and multilingual society. And this non-partisan approach earned Mr. Lau commendation from the Foreign Minister and Prime Minister. In any case, by the end of 2016, Beijing was increasingly concerned with the Trump administration and decided to settle. In January 2017, the armored personnel carriers were released. The influence operation wound down, and after a Chinese agent of influence was exposed and expelled, seems to have paused. Relations with China returned to normal. Chinese leaders went out of their way to project friendliness. In late 2017, when news of Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong being invited to the White House by President Trump became public, he was hastily invited to visit Beijing first. He did so and was received by Xi Jinping and other senior Chinese leaders. Now, most of the means by which the Chinese narratives were spread in 2016-2017 were not illegal. Not illegal until perhaps recently when the law on falsehoods online becomes law. But anyway, at that time they were not illegal. However, in August 2017, a Chinese academic, Huang Jing, with dual US and PRC citizenship, teaching at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, was expelled, and he and his wife were permanently banned from Singapore. The Ministry of Home Affairs statement of 4th August 2017, announcing the expulsion, said that Huang Jin had, and I quote, identified as an agent of influence of a foreign country who had, I quote again, knowingly interacted with intelligence organizations and agents of the foreign country and cooperated with them to influence the Singapore government's foreign policy and public opinion in Singapore. To this end, he engaged prominent and influential Singaporeans and gave them what he claimed was privileged information about the foreign country so as to influence their opinions in favor of that country. Huang also recruited others in aid of his operations. The MHA statement went on to say that Huang Jin, and I quote again, gave supposedly privileged information to a senior member of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in order that it be conveyed to the Singapore government. The information was duly conveyed by that senior member of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy to very senior public officials who are in a position to direct Singapore's foreign policy. The clear intention was to use that information to cause the Singapore government to change its foreign policy, end quote. And the statement concluded that Huang Jin's collaboration with foreign intelligence agents was, and I quote again, subversion and foreign interference in Singapore's domestic politics. The Singapore government has not named the foreign country. Not explicitly named, but you have to be particularly obtuse not to know which one. In 1988, Singapore had expelled an American diplomat for interference in domestic politics. We were quite even-handed, you know. That diplomat and his superiors were trying to impose a Western liberal democratic political identity on Singapore by encouraging a prominent but disgruntled Singaporean, one whose views the American diplomat and his superiors must have believed were aligned with American values, to form a political party to contest elections, and promised him safe refuge in the US should he run into trouble. Now, Huang Jin is an academic, not a diplomat. But as I said, it's clear enough for whom Huang Jin worked. I told you he had dual US and PRC citizenship. In case you don't know, holding dual citizenship is forbidden in China. Huang Jin today holds a senior academic position in China, apparently without sanction for having acquired American citizenship. So you go figure. There is a telling episode, again a personal story, to the Huang Jin story. Shortly after Huang Jin's expulsion, a prominent Singapore ethnic Chinese businessman with extensive business interests in China invited me to lunch out of the blue. I had no contact with this chap for a decade or more. I put him off several times, but he persisted, and eventually I accepted his invitation, out of curiosity more than anything else. I wondered what he was up to. The businessman spent the entire lunch repeatedly stressing how patriotic a Singaporean he was. The obvious intention was for me to pass the message to the government. It was an indication of how deep the reach and how effective the Chinese operation had been. Why did he invite me? I know him, I told you, but we never had any contact for 10 years or more, at least 10 years, probably more, I can't remember exactly. Well, on 25th August 2017, I had spoken to business leaders about Chinese influence operations. The lunch invitation from this businessman came shortly after that talk. And during that talk, referring to the Huang Jin incident, I had expressed the personal opinion that sooner or later we may have to arrest and detain some members of the Singapore Chinese business community under the ISA for carrying Chinese water. We had done so in the past, and we might have to do so again. Now, the talk in which I made these statements was a closed-door session, and my lunch host was not present, but my comments may have been reported to him. In any case, the guilty flee where no man pursues. Now, 2016, 2017 was not the first time China had tried to influence Singapore's policies. In 2004, China deployed intense pressure on Singapore through all three tracks when then Deputy Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong decided to pay an unofficial visit to Taiwan. The Chinese were trying to get Singapore to cancel the visit. Singapore follows a one China policy. But if China had succeeded in getting us to cancel the visit, it would have forced a significant modification of our approach towards Taiwan. Excuse me. Now, Taiwan is certainly one of Singapore's core interests. We acknowledge that. But the ability to defend ourselves, and hence the requirement of a small country for training space, as you know, we do train in Taiwan. I'm not surprised many of you here who have done national service have gone there for training. Myself, I've been there 8 times. So we need training space, and consequently, our leaders need to periodically visit the providers of training space. And this is no less a vital Singapore national interest than Taiwan is to China. The clear expectation, however, in deploying pressure on us to get the visit cancelled was that small Singapore should subordinate our interests to big China's interests. But we could not succumb to pressure without grievous loss of credibility. The foreign minister at that time, Professor S. Jayakumar, has recounted this episode in some detail in his book, Diplomacy, A Singapore Perspective, which if any of you are really interested in our foreign policy, you should read it. Now, Professor Jayakumar made clear to his Chinese counterpart that while we knew Taiwan was a Chinese core interest and we followed a one China policy, Singapore had its own interests and a small country had to maintain credibility. We would lose credibility if we cancelled the visit under Chinese pressure. So we stood firm, dealt with the issue calmly, and after PM Lee Hsien Loong met Hu Jintao at the APEC summit in Chile in November 2004, relations with China returned to normal. Now, the point is, the 2004 visit by then DPM Lee Hsien Loong was not the first unofficial visit by a Singapore leader to Taiwan. Previous unofficial visits by even more senior Singapore leaders had passed without incident. The 2004 visit conformed to the established pattern in form and substance of previous visits. But what the 2004 incident had in common with the 2016-2017 episode was that both occurred at times of political transition in Singapore. By 2004, it was clear that Lee Hsien Loong would replace Goh Chok Tong as Singapore's third Prime Minister. By 2016, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong had made public his intention to step aside sometime after the next general election and let a younger fourth generation of political leaders take over. And the pressures deployed on both occasions may have been intended as tests of the resolve of new leaders and as warnings to new leaders about what to expect unless they were more accommodating towards China. As Prime Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong had to resist Chinese pressures too, as well as pressures from other countries, notably Malaysia. And we shall see what, if anything, China and other countries do during our next general elections. Now, Chinese influence operations in Singapore are not a recent phenomenon. China's United Front activities in the late 1950s and early 1960s have been mentioned in passing in earlier lectures. But those activities were part of an open political struggle. But there was another covert attempt to shape public opinion in Singapore after China's proxies in the United Front were politically defeated. This attempt differed from the 2016-2017 episode, mainly in the means deployed, which reflected the information technologies available at the time. Now, on 15th May 1971, most of you were not born, the Singapore government announced the arrest and detention of three ethnic Chinese Singaporeans under the Internal Security Act. The government press statement revealed that, and I quote, officials of a communist intelligence service based in Hong Kong had between 1964 and 68 given loans totaling more than 7 million Hong Kong dollars, which was then quite a princely sum, at the then ridiculously low interest rate of 0.1% per annum. That was very low at that time. And this money had been given to ethnic Singapore Chinese businessmen to start an English language daily newspaper named the Eastern Sun. The paper commenced publication in 1966. In return for the loans, the Eastern Sun was required not to oppose the PRC on major issues and to remain neutral on minor issues. Now, given this history, the likelihood is that the current pause in Chinese influence operations is only just that, only a pause that will eventually resume. United Front work and appeals to overseas Chinese stem from 2 out of 3 of China's intrinsic identities: China as a Leninist state and China as a civilization state. And China cannot entirely forswear such tactics unless it abandons these identities. And this is thus not going to happen. In any case, the overhang, the after effects of the 2016-27 operation are still with us. Now, China conducts influence operations against other overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia and tries to intervene in the domestic politics of other ASEAN member states as well. But as the only ethnic Chinese majority sovereign state in the region, China is a special case. A majority Chinese Singapore that nevertheless conducts an independent foreign policy may be something of an anomaly in Chinese eyes, all the more so given Xi Jinping's attitude towards overseas Chinese. To succumb and subordinate Singapore's national interests to China's interests would seriously risk the imposition of, through a gradual process of small steps, a Chinese identity on multiracial Singapore. And this is not a risk applicable to other ASEAN member states where the Chinese are a minority. What was most significant about the Eastern Sun affair was that among those detained were previously strong supporters of the Kuomintang, and one was a convert to Islam. What linked them was their Chinese chauvinism. Ethnicity clearly overrode political or religious loyalties. And it's a very small step from legitimate ethnic pride to chauvinism. And would it be prudent to assume that no Chinese Singaporean will ever be tempted to take that step? I don't think so. Over the long run, to behave as a small country vis-a-vis Singapore risks severely compromising, if not entirely erasing, the essential values, multiracial meritocracy, that Mr. Rajaratnam had identified as the ultimate purpose of our foreign policy and on which the social compact of modern Singapore rests. The risk of erosion of our essential values was the real issue underlying the controversy over the idea that small countries must always behave like small countries. The South China Sea was only the proximate cause or the proximate issue. Now, if our essential values are eroded, Singapore's social compact could be severely strained, if not broken. If our social compact is broken, it will be very difficult, perhaps impossible, to put it together again. Externally, the considerable diplomatic and political effort that we have taken to persuade our neighbors and the world that Singapore is not a third China would have been squandered. Influence operations by other countries do not pose the same kind of risk. Western influence operations that seek to impose a Western liberal political identity on Singapore appeals, I think, to only a small section of our public. Now, preserving our essential values is an existential issue on which we cannot compromise, no matter how much we want a good relationship with big countries. It was therefore precisely because Big China mounted a sophisticated operation to pressure small Singapore not to comment on the South China Sea that we had to stand up for our right to do so, and we commented in the most even-handed, even boring way possible. If you remember the statement I read out to you, and I bet you will not remember because it was so boring, it's impossible to remember. Now, the general point is applicable to our relations with all big countries and to all issues where our vital interests come into conflict with the interests of big countries. Small countries have very little diplomatic currency except credibility. And if credibility is eroded, so also is our ability to defend our core interests. Small countries must learn to stand firm and deal calmly with big country pressures. As former Foreign Minister Professor Jayakumar has written, and I quote, "Giving in to the demands of big countries may be expedient in the short term, but it will be costly in the long term." Now, every foreign minister of Singapore, every permanent secretary of Singapore has had to deal with this reality in one form or another. There have been times when we have had to cope with simultaneous pressures from both the US and China, who wanted us to take contradictory positions on the same issue. And I do not think we will ever be free of this fundamental issue. Now, I focus on China because for the reasons I explained, it poses the greatest risk. But of course, China is not the only country that seeks to impose a particular identity on Singapore. I referred to Western influence operations earlier in this lecture. Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries, some Gulf countries, propagate an Arabized Muslim identity, just as Iran propagates Shiism. Different varieties of evangelical Christianity take advantage of their political clout in the US and the general commitment of the West to simplistic and absolutist notions of freedom of religion and speech to propagate themselves. And not far from our borders, radical variants of Buddhism and Hinduism, which are oxymoronic, but nevertheless observable as political facts, are exerting strong influence. Not all these phenomena are the result of state action, but what all of them have in common is the claim of greater authenticity for values, whether secular, ethnic, or religious, than that is being propagated, for the value that is being propagated. And to claim greater authenticity for any value you happen to favor is divisive and a threat to the social cohesion of a plural society like Singapore. As I pointed out in a previous lecture, we live in an era where powerful ethnic and religious centrifugal forces have been unleashed and identity politics is spreading. And it will be imprudent to assume that Singapore is somehow immune from these global trends. And these broader forces create an environment that facilitates those countries, like China, inclined to use identity as an instrument of foreign policy. On 10 July 2017, about 10 days after the controversy over Kishore's article broke out, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in an answer to a question about the role of small countries, he was having a roundup interview after a visit to Germany. And he said, and I quote, "This is a dangerous world. There are countries big and small. We have to take the world as it is. At the same time, we have to protect our interests and do the best for ourselves as we can in the world." I think these two factors are complementary. They are not contradictory. Now, Mr. Lee was not espousing what I had in my first lecture called the crude realism of Thucydides, but the pragmatic realism of our first generation leaders that recognizes that even small countries are never without agency and were willing to take risks when the interests at stake were important enough. And in that interview, Mr. Lee went on to say, and I quote again, "We have to be aware of the realities, but at the same time, that does not mean surrendering ourselves to our fates. When there are important issues that arise which concern Singapore, I think it is our responsibility to highlight them, to deal with them and to push for them, particularly when it is a matter of our security or safety or fundamental interest concerning Singapore's position in the world, such as the rule of international law, such as the peaceful resolution of disputes. If we do not stand up and be countered, you cannot just lie low and hope nobody will notice you. That is how Singapore must conduct our foreign policy." Now, Mr. Lee and Professor Jayakumar, in the bit I quoted earlier, were making essentially the same point as Mr. Rajaratnam when he laid out the philosophy, the basic objectives, and the fundamental principles of Singapore's foreign policy in his 1965 statement, which I drew your attention to early in this series of lectures. "We are well aware," Mr. Rajaratnam said, that, and I quote, "Southeast Asia is in fact a battleground of great power politics, and Singapore could as a pawn be used as a major power to tip the military balance in this region. And this was the reason why," quote again, "immediately on independence we declared ourselves non-aligned. If Singapore's policy is foreign policy aligned," Mr. Rajaratnam argued, "our policy," and I quote again, "becomes a mere reproduction of the foreign policy of a more powerful partner. And I quote again, and this is an important quote, once a country has put itself in a position of having to follow the foreign policy of another country, there must eventually be loss of freedom of action in regard to basic domestic policies." Now, for that reason, Mr. Rajaratnam made clear, and I quote again, "Non-alignment does not mean indifference on our part to genuine issues. Singapore's stand on specific issues will be determined strongly by national interests. The promotion of national interests is the essence of foreign policy of all countries, big or small." And then Mr. Rajaratnam went on to make the point about Singapore's ultimate goal that I have stressed throughout this series of lectures. Mr. Rajaratnam was speaking in the context of the Cold War, when the main great power contest was between the US and Soviet Union. What he has to say, however, is even more applicable to the current situation of heightened long-term US-China strategic competition. And this is a more complicated contest than the Cold War because the division between friend and foe is not as clear-cut, as I mentioned in the last lecture. All the more vital, therefore, that we should know our own interests and defend them. Now, China is not an enemy. I don't think China is today out to destroy independent Singapore as it was during an earlier period when Beijing supported the Malayan Communist Party and refused to recognize Singapore's independence. Today, Singapore doesn't want to destroy us. China doesn't want to destroy us. China merely wants to capture us. The threat arises because, like the British academic I quoted in my second lecture, who predicted insurrection in Singapore in the 1970s, China knows many details about Singapore but does not seem to understand the most important thing about Singapore. So today, if China destroys us, it will be by inadvertence, by accident. Now, this struck me that China knows lots of details about Singapore but doesn't know the most important thing about Singapore, when I came across a book entitled Lee Kuan Yew Through the Eyes of Chinese Scholars. This book was published in 2015 in both Mandarin and English. In 2015, the year Mr. Lee died, as a kind of commemorative volume. And the book consists of 16 chapters by individual scholars on various aspects of Singapore. The chapters were quite sympathetic towards Singapore, even admiring. But apart from a handful of chapters by the likes of Wang Gangwu, Su Guanyin, and a few others who were Singaporeans, who had lived and taught in Singapore, a person unacquainted with Singapore could read most chapters without realizing that Singapore is a multiracial country. Yet this is the single most important aspect of the Singapore that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues built and their successors sustained. Now, our core national interest, as defined by our essential value of multiracial meritocracy, lies at the intersection between politics and policy, between the domestic and the foreign, between the normative and the objective. It is where our volitions meet and sometimes collide with hard external realities. And if the core can be preserved, other international problems, however difficult, can be managed. If the core is compromised, international problems will become even more difficult and perhaps unmanageable. To navigate internationally, we must be absolutely clear in our own minds about who we are and who we want to remain, and make this absolutely clear to all our international and regional interlocutors. And that is why, in February 2017, the government, at some political cost, how much we will find out at the next general election, but at some political cost, amended the Constitution to allow a minority candidate to be elected president if, after a certain hiatus, there was no minority president. Accordingly, on 13 September 2017, Madam Halimah Yacob, a Muslim woman, was declared president after no other candidate was found eligible. Now, the move to amend the Constitution came as the Chinese influence operation was winding down. And I do not know whether the timing of the constitutional amendment was calculated or whether it was coincidental. But it does not really matter. The president is the highest symbol of state, and ensuring that the president will not always be Chinese was an important signal to Singaporeans, an important signal to our region, and an important signal to the world. But this fundamental reason for the constitutional amendment was not sufficiently well explained. The public debate went off at several tangents, one of which was whether having a reserved presidential election was a derogation of meritocracy. And to me, it was heartening to witness the principle of multiracial meritocracy staunchly defended by minorities that stood to benefit from the constitutional amendment. But it was a debate about perfection, not about what was necessary in the real world and why. So, debates about perfection are interesting, but they are about perfection. They are not very relevant to this world. And the parliamentary debate on the reading of the bill was largely about details which obscured rather than clarified the really important issue. And I suspect by that time, the public was not paying much attention. Now, to be sure, Deputy Prime Minister Teo Chien's speech at the second reading of the Constitutional Amendment Bill was a very clear exposition of the essential issues. I don't have time to go into the arguments he made, but what I said is the core argument, and go and look it up if you are interested. But that came at the end of the public debate, and it will be more effective at the beginning. The Prime Minister was even clearer in a speech he made on 23rd September 2017. Again, it's worthwhile you looking up that speech. But that came after Madam Halima was already President. But as I said, both speeches have a validity that transcends the immediate occasion and should be carefully studied by anyone who really wants to understand our foreign policy. So what could compromise the core? Now, this series of lectures are about foreign policy, and I have focused on the external factors, in particular attempts by China and other countries to influence how we define ourselves. The most difficult challenges, however, are however, internal and arise from what I had called in the very first of these lectures an insufficiently foreign policy literate public opinion. A common failing in all democratic systems is privileging the immediate over the long term. Now, Singapore suffers from this far less than other democratic systems, but as our politics gets more complicated, as it inevitably will, our politicians will have to pay more attention to just getting elected. Ironically, as they get less complacent about winning office, the risk is they may get more complacent about foreign policy, because foreign policy seldom brings immediate political benefits. And the lack of a sufficiently foreign policy literate public can accentuate this risk, because all politicians must respond to as well as lead or shape public opinion. Now, this risk is at present low, I think, but not non-existent, and in the absence of a sufficiently foreign policy literate public can grow because some foreign policy imperatives may conflict with domestic considerations. Now, as politicians focus more on politics, as politicians everywhere must, the policy slack must be taken up by the civil service. Our civil service deals with complicated issues very well, much better than most. But civil services in general are usually not very good at dealing with complexity. Remember, I made a difference between the complicated and the complex. Civil services in general are usually not very good at dealing with complexity, because dealing with complexity inevitably entails risks, and foreign policy complexity perhaps more risk than in other domains. And there are small early signs that in the foreign policy domain, our civil service is becoming risk-averse. This too often results in trying to limit risk by spinning bureaucratic processes rather than taking decisions, dealing with slices of problems rather than their broader implications, being narrowly transactional in relationships, and blurring clarity by overly hedging assessments, or settling for short-term solutions because the long term is somebody else's problem. As I pointed out at the beginning of this series of lectures, sometimes trying to avoid risk is the riskier option, particularly at a time of greater than usual international flux. As I also pointed out early in the series of lectures, historically, small city-states have generally not survived for very long. The exception was the Venetian Republic. Venice existed for over a millennium between the 7th century and the 18th century, but it too eventually declined and failed. The reasons for Venice's failure are complex, but C.P. Snow summarized the essential reason best in his 1959 Reed lecture at Cambridge University, entitled The Two Cultures. Worth reading. Snow was discussing the problems of Britain in the mid-20th century and drew a parallel with Venice in its last half-century. And he said, and I'll read out the quote to you. Quote, "Like us, they had once been fabulously lucky. They had become rich, as we did, by accident. They had acquired immense political skill, just as we have. A good many of them were tough-minded, realistic, patriotic men. They knew just as clearly as we know that the current of history had begun to flow against them. Many of them gave their minds to working out ways to keep going. It would have meant breaking the pattern into which they had crystallized. They were fond of the pattern just as we are fond of ours. They never found the will to break it." End quote. Now, don't misunderstand me. Historical parallels are never exact, and I certainly do not think that the current of history is flowing against Singapore. On the contrary, we are fortunate to be plugged into a dynamic region. By 1959, Britain was an exhausted country. We are still young. Unlike Britain in 1959, we have no nostalgia for past glories, imagined or real, because there are no past glories. Our leadership, although perhaps not every last civil servant or the general public, is well aware of the need to break the pattern while holding firm on fundamentals. Nothing is predetermined, and there is no reason why Singapore must fail. The weaknesses I see developing in our civil service are not yet fatal flaws and can be rectified, provided they are squarely recognized. There are nevertheless lessons to be drawn from Snow's analysis of Venice's failure. And what Snow tells us is that failure need not be the consequence of some catastrophic event, some spectacular disaster or drastic mistake. Failure could well be, and perhaps more often is, the result of inertia or complacency. Failure could be the result of the gradual, almost imperceptible, aggregation of small, individually insignificant decisions not taken, decisions postponed, or decisions avoided. And as a reminder of that invidious danger, it seems appropriate to end this last lecture by quoting two stanzas from W.H. Auden's poem, The Fall of Rome. And these are the stanzas. Caesar's double bed is warm, as an unimportant clerk writes, I do not like my work on a pink official form. Altogether elsewhere, vast herds of reindeer move across miles and miles of golden moss, silently and very fast. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me so patiently for so many weeks. Thank you.